In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. I give thanks to Father Tom for the privilege of being able to speak here during Holy Week, and hope that it's taken a little bit of the load off you. I haven't been retired so long that I have forgotten what Holy Week is like for a priest, especially a priest who is alone in a parish. So any way to be of help, I'm glad to. One is not a student of the Bible for very long before one sees that the Gospel of John in many ways is very different from the other three Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In fact, we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the synoptics. Syn as in synonym, the same. Optic, of course, having to do with the eyes. They look the same. But John is clearly very different. And tonight's Gospel is a very glaring example of how different it is. Here we are at the Last Supper, and there is no account of the institution of the sacrament. Instead, we have a foot washing. It is during supper that Jesus took off his robe and girded himself with a towel and washed his disciples' feet. Why would John emphasize this and completely ignore the institution of the sacrament? I had the privilege in seminary of studying under a very prominent New Testament professor by the name of Reginald Fuller. And we were talking about just this thing one day in class. And by then we understood well that John was no doubt the last gospel that was written. John lived to a ripe old age. He died in exile because of his faith, but he lived to a ripe old age. And so the patterns of the church had had an opportunity to become already well established. Was it possible, I suggested, that John was making a kind of protest against a perfunctory performance of the sacrament? Reginald kind of chuckled a bit, seemed rather amused, and said, "So the foot washing is like an underground liturgy." Well, the fact of the matter is that human nature is such that it does not take us long for anything, no matter how meaningful it starts, when it is repeated and repeated and repeated, to become kind of perfunctory, where we simply go through the motions. We sort of take for granted that grace that is there to be had in the case of the sacrament. And we know that Paul faced this to Corinthians. On either side of the passage that was read in our epistle lessons tonight, we have Paul's context within which he gives us these words of institution, this tradition that is handed on to him, which he passes on to them. Because he has challenged them in the way in which they come to the agape meal, to the sacrament of the Lord's body and blood. And he concludes after this passage with a stern warning not to come in an unworthy way, but to examine oneself, he says, so that you will not be judged by God. Paul wrote those words easily 30 to 40 years before John wrote his words in his gospel. Now, whether John was in fact reacting to the perfunctory performance of the sacrament, we cannot know. But what we can see is very clear that John is more concerned about communicating the meaning of the sacrament than about the logistics and the details. He dedicates an entire chapter, the 6th chapter of John, to what is often called the bread of life discourse, where he speaks about himself as the bread from heaven that will come down and nurture his people. His blood poured out that will bring life, not only to his disciples, but eventually to the entire world. Oh, John well understood what the sacrament was all about. And it seems to be his particular passion to make sure that we get it, that we understand that when we receive that body and blood, we are taking into ourselves the very life of the risen Lord, and we are sharing it among one another. Now, at the Last Supper, John explores the meaning of the sacrament in a whole different way. He tells us how Jesus, during that supper, took off his robe, girded himself with a towel, and washed his disciples' feet. And when he was done, he says, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and indeed I am. If I, your teacher and Lord, then, have washed your feet, then you should wash one another's feet." See, Jesus, in John's Gospel, is trying to convey to his disciples something very important. That it is more than just a token and a sign that he is leaving to his disciples in the bread and the wine, in the body and the blood. But he is leaving them a whole life in himself. And that life must reflect the very life of Christ. You see, this is not magic. The words of institution are not an incantation. The body and the blood of Christ are not a potion. It is a sacrament. And as St. Augustine reminds us, it is a sure and certain means of that inward and spiritual grace which the outward and visible signs are there to communicate. But it is never, never to be presumed upon. God never allows us to presume upon his grace. Grace is something that is to be lived out in our lives. And the sacrament becomes meaningless unless we do it. There's an important dynamic that goes on in that life in Christ, where we are nourished by that body and that blood. And under the strength of that grace, we are called to humble service, first to our brothers and sisters in the believing community, but then to the whole world beyond that believing community. And as we struggle to live faithfully into that vision, as we struggle against our human natures, fallen as they are, to truly love one another as Christ loved us, we find that we crave that nurturance that comes in the sacrament that we have. And so we come, and we are nourished again, and strengthened for further service that makes us hungry again to come back. And our lives take on a dimension of joy and a dimension that of love that offers itself as a true alternative to those living in this world in which we live. The values of our life together in Christ priorities of this world. And yet, through our life in Christ, the world is able to see that there is an important difference, and that indeed we offer the way of life itself. Sunday by Sunday, we come here and we celebrate the Eucharist together. We are nourished in Christ's body and blood. It would be easy for that sacrament to become perfunctory, to take that grace for granted, even to presume upon it. Tonight, we are called to deeper reflection about what is really going on here and why Jesus has left this great gift to us. As we hear the call to humble service, as we hear his command to love one another as he has loved us, even to the point of death, we are challenged to understand that what we are coming here to share together is something that truly is God-given and is at the heart and center of our lives. We need to come anew and afresh, accepting that challenge within our lives and feeling that call to let it truly make a difference. If I, the teacher, have washed your feet, so you should wash one another's feet. And